doing Genesis 42 through 45, and I'm going to be giving a brief summary of Genesis 42. And this is when Joseph's brothers went to Egypt. So Jacob sent his sons to Egypt, and only 10 out of the 11 of the sons, because he wanted to keep Benjamin there, the youngest one, so no calamity would happen to him, meaning that anything dangerous or death would come upon him. So when Jacob had sent his sons to Egypt, they were going to Egypt for grain, because there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and grain was a universal food source that could last long and be used as money as well. So when they had arrived into Egypt, Joseph had recognized them and remembered them from his dreams, and they bowed down before him. But when they bowed, they didn't recognize him. So this had made Joseph very angry, and he asked them, "Where do you come from?" And then his brothers said that they came from the land of Canaan, and that they're looking for food. And then Joseph claimed that they're spies, and that they're being defiant of Pharaoh. And so then the brothers has claimed that they're just looking for food, and that they're not a spy or anything. So this resulted into Joseph imprisoning them for 3 days, and on the third day he let 9 out of the 10 other brothers go, because he said in order for the other brother to be released, you have to bring the youngest brother back to him to prove that they're honest men, and if not, that the other brother will die that's in prison. So while they were transitioning into leaving, Joseph gave the command to give them their grains, and to put their money back in their sacks. In sacks was wallets. And so when that happened, they were going back, and then they had told Jacob the news, and then Jacob became very scared, and was worried that the same scenario is going to happen to his other son Joseph, and that it would happen to his youngest son Benjamin. And so towards the end of the chapter of Genesis 42, he said that if anything of calamity would happen to Benjamin, that he is going to die in sorrow. And then, so the main issue in this story to me is that how the brothers did not recognize who Joseph was at the time, and then how forgiving Joseph was, because in another scenario, I feel like he should have just imprisoned them for a longer time, and that he shouldn't have gave them any food because of what they did to him when they had sold him.
My group consisted of myself, Henry, Austyn, and Trent. We were assigned Genesis chapters 42 through 45. I'll be giving a brief summary of Genesis chapter 43. Chapter 43 is pretty much about the continuation of starvation and famine in Egypt. Once they in Egypt reached a point to where their provisions and supplies began to run out, Jacob told his children to purchase more food. Despite the fact that he was hesitant to release Benjamin at first, with a little persuading, he was basically bought over. In other words, he basically allowed Benjamin to attend the voyage, because he knew there was no other way that they'd receive the supplies and materials they needed. Before the excursion began, the siblings gathered twice as much cash as they had the first time they visited Egypt. Because mind you, this isn't the first time they visited Egypt. Genesis chapter 43 is basically their return to Egypt. So after gathering that cash, they made it to Egypt and stood before Joseph. But at the time of their arrival, Joseph was busy taking care of other things. So they were assigned to a private worker who in fact worked for Joseph. He told them that Joseph would appear later on in the day, and that he'd be taking care of their needs for the moment. When they got to the house, of course, the brothers were afraid, because they weren't 1,000% sure of what to expect. So they addressed the worker and made it clear that they had the cash they had, which again was double the amount of what they had from their previous trip. And he told them, he pretty much silenced them, or hushed them in a sense, and told them that he was aware of this because he had the cash that they had from their first trip to Egypt, and told them that God had blessed them with more, which is why they had twice the amount that they did end up having. At that point, he drove them to the house where they arranged their gifts for Joseph, which were going to be given to Joseph in exchange for the food. Joseph showed up around early afternoon and greeted them and asked for information about their father, such as his well-being, his health, and things of that nature. Once that conversation ended, the boys were no longer afraid. They were able to breathe easy. They enjoyed their meal and went about their way.
All right, Genesis chapter 44. So Joseph had ordered his servants to fill his brother's sacks with food and to put money that they had brought to put back in the sacks. And Joseph also ordered him to put his silver cup with Benjamin's sack, his youngest son. Right. The next day, they had left the city, and after a short distance, right, Joseph had ordered his steward to follow and overtake the men, right? And when they arrived to the men, he asked, this is part of verse 4, Genesis chapter 44, verse 4, why have you repaid evil for good? And then when the steward overtook the men, he accused them of theft, but the brothers had said that they didn't steal anything and they had just returned the money that they found in their sacks. Chapter 44, verse 9 says, whichever of your servants is found with it shall die, and we will also be my Lord's servants. So basically, the steward had agreed to had agreed to that, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, like I had said previously. And then finally, when they had returned back to the city, Judah had begun pleading and begging to Joseph to just take him as a slave instead. He was pleading very hard, and he began to say, this is part of verse 31, chapter 44, verse 31. As soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And that verse, he was talking about Benjamin's father, that he will grieve so hard to the point where he will die, because that is the last son he had of his beloved wife. And yep.
All right, so I'm here to talk about Genesis chapter 45. Okay, so Joseph was surrounded by a bunch of people, and then he began to cry that he wanted to be alone so he can talk to his brothers. So once he was finally alone with his brothers, he began to tell them how he was circumcised and asked if their father was still alive. His brothers couldn't even answer the question because they were just in there in total shock that he was even in front of them. So after that, Joseph began to explain how he know how they sold him to Egypt. And he was like, that's not why I'm here. I'm not here because I'm upset about that. I'm here because God sent me. He sent me here to take care of y'all. So after that, he explained how God made him the father of Pharaoh and also made him ruler of Egypt. And he also wanted his father to know that, and he wanted them to go back and tell his father. So then after that, he began to tell him about a famine that was going on at the time, and he had 5 years left. He said, even though that's going on right now, he explained that they'll be going to a different region called Goshen, so they could be closer to him, and that everything there belonged to them, and told them to bring everything that they needed. All right, so once everybody arrived and he reached the Pharaoh then told Joseph to tell his brothers to load everything up, and then head to Canaan. And then he also told the sons of Israel to take their father and households and come to him, and he will give them great land in Egypt. And then after that, Joseph was commanded to give out wagons to them, wagons of stuff that they needed. So after the sons of Israel did what they needed to do, Joseph did what he was commanded and then gave them on their wagons and gave them everything that they needed for their journey. He also sent his father 10 donkeys, and attached to those 10 donkeys was a bunch of grain and bread, etc., extra stuff like that. So once they finally arrived to Canaan, they told his father that Joseph was alive, and then he was the ruler of Egypt. At first, he did not believe him, but then once he saw all the stuff he sent him, the grain and the bread, his spirit was revived, and then he was like, I must go see him before I go die. And that's verse 20. That's in verse 28. He explains how he must go see him before he dies.